Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today's episode is about three words that are extremely common, and at the same time, surprisingly confusing when you try to use them in real conversations. We're talking about much, many, and a lot of. And this is one of those topics that most learners feel like they already understand. You see these words very early in your learning journey, you practice them in simple exercises, and everything seems clear, at least in theory. But then, when you actually try to speak, something doesn't feel right. You hesitate for a second. You're not sure which one to choose, and sometimes you end up saying something that sounds just a little bit off, even if the meaning is understandable.
Yeah, exactly. And what makes this topic interesting is that the confusion doesn't come from complexity in the traditional sense. These are not advanced words. They're not rare. In fact, they're everywhere. Native speakers use them constantly in all kinds of situations, casual conversations, questions, everyday comments. But the problem is that learners often try to apply very simple rules to situations that are a little more nuanced than they seem. So you end up with sentences that are technically built with the right idea, but the wrong choice of word. And that's where things like much people or many money start to appear.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is that when learners make these mistakes, they usually know something is wrong. They say the sentence and there's that small moment of doubt. Like, that didn't sound right, but I'm not sure why. And the frustrating part is that the difference between the correct and incorrect version is often very small. Just one word changes, but it changes how natural your English sounds. So before we go into examples, let's slow things down and focus on the core idea behind all of this. Because once you understand this idea, you don't need to memorize dozens of rules or exceptions. Everything becomes much more intuitive. Exactly. And this distinction is not just a detail. It's the foundation of how much and many work. Because these words are not interchangeable. They are directly connected to the type of noun you're using, whether it's something you can count individually or something that exists as a mass without clear units.
And that's where a lot of confusion starts. Because in your own language, you might not think about this distinction in the same way, or you might express it differently. So when you try to translate directly, your brain focuses on the idea of quantity, but not on the type of noun. And English cares about that difference a lot.
So in today's episode, we're going to break this down step by step, but in a way that feels practical and real. We're not just going to give you definitions like countable and uncountable and leave it there. We're going to explore how these words actually behave in real conversations, how native speakers use them, and why certain combinations sound natural while others don't.
Yeah, and we're also going to talk about something that many learners don't realize at first. Even when much is technically correct, native speakers often prefer something else, and that's where a lot of becomes really important.
Exactly. So this is not just about correctness. It's about sounding natural, confident, and comfortable when you speak. All right, so let's start with the foundation of everything we're going to talk about today, the difference between things you can count and things you can't.
All right, so let's start with the first part of that idea. What does it actually mean to say that something is countable? Because this is one of those terms that people hear all the time, but don't always fully internalize.
Yeah, exactly. When we say that something is countable, we simply mean that you can separate it into individual units and count those units one by one.
Right. So if I say something like books, I can say 1 book, 2 books, 3 books. Each one is a clear, separate item.
Exactly. And the same thing happens with words like people, cars, ideas, phones, students. All of these can be counted individually. You can ask how many and give a specific number.
And I think this part usually feels very natural for learners, because it's very concrete. You can visualize it. You can imagine the objects.
Yeah, there's no mystery here. If you can count it, it's countable.
Now let's move to the other side. What about things that are uncountable?
So uncountable nouns are things that you cannot easily separate into individual units. They usually exist as a mass, or a general concept, not as distinct items that you can count one by one.
Right. So, for example, money. You don't normally say 1 money, 2 monies, 3 monies. That doesn't work.
Exactly. Instead, money exists as a general quantity. You can have more of it or less of it, but you don't count it directly.
And the same thing happens with words like time, water, information, advice, sugar. These are not things you naturally break into units when you speak.
Yeah, and that's an important point. Because technically in real life, you can measure these things. You can say, a glass of water, a piece of advice, $1, but the noun itself, water, advice, money, is still treated as uncountable.
Exactly. So the key idea is not whether something can be measured in reality, but how the language treats it.
And I think this is where a lot of learners have that first aha moment, because they realize that English is not always describing reality directly. It's organizing reality in a specific way.
Yeah. And once you accept that, you stop asking, but why can't I count this? And you start asking, how does English see this thing? All right, so now that we have that distinction clear, let's connect it to the words we're focusing on today.
Because this is where everything starts to make sense.
Many is used with countable nouns, much is used with uncountable nouns.
So for example, many people, many books, many students, because these are all countable.
And on the other side, much money, much time, much water, because these are uncountable.
So now let's look at the mistakes we mentioned at the beginning, because now you can actually see why they happen.
Yeah, take this sentence, much people.
Now you can see the problem. People is countable. You can count people. So using much here doesn't match the type of noun.
Exactly. So the correct version is many people.
Now the other one, many money.
Same idea. Money is uncountable, so using many doesn't work here.
So the correct version is much money.
And I think what's interesting here is that these mistakes are not random. They come from a logical place, but they're based on a different system.
Yeah, your brain is trying to express quantity, but it's not checking the type of noun. And that small detail makes all the difference. All right, so at this point you might be thinking, okay, I get it. Countable, uncountable, many, much. Seems clear.
Yeah, but now comes the part that surprises a lot of learners. Because even when you use much correctly, it can still sound a little unnatural.
Exactly. So now we need to talk about something very important, how people actually speak in real life.
All right, so now we're moving into something that surprises a lot of learners. Because up to this point, everything feels very logical. You understand the difference between countable and uncountable nouns. You understand when to use many and when to use much. And it seems like you're ready to use this in real life.
Yeah, but then something interesting happens. You try to use much in a normal sentence, and even though it's technically correct, it doesn't sound completely natural.
Exactly. Let's take a simple example. I have much money.
Now, grammatically, there's nothing wrong with this sentence. Money is uncountable. Much is the correct word. So everything looks fine.
But if you say this in a real conversation, it sounds a little strange. Not completely wrong, but not natural either.
And this is where we need to make a very important distinction. Something can be correct, but still not be how people usually speak.
Exactly, because language is not only about rules, it's also about patterns of usage, what people actually say most of the time. So now the question becomes, when do people actually use much naturally?
And the answer is very important. Much is most commonly used in questions, negative sentences.
Right. So, for example, do you have much time? Do you drink much coffee?
Or in negatives, I don't have much time. She doesn't drink much water.
And in these cases, much sounds completely natural. There's no problem at all.
So what's happening here is something subtle. In questions and negatives, English tends to use much more comfortably. It fits the rhythm of the language.
But in affirmative sentences, especially when you're just stating something, much starts to feel a bit formal or slightly unnatural in everyday speech.
And this is exactly where a lot of becomes so important, because a lot of is the form that people naturally prefer in most affirmative sentences.
So instead of saying, I have much money, you say, I have a lot of money.
And now the sentence feels completely natural, relaxed, conversational, the way people actually speak.
And here's another interesting point. A lot of is very flexible.
Yeah, because unlike much and many, a lot of works with both types of nouns.
So you can say, a lot of money, uncountable. A lot of people, countable.
And in both cases, it sounds perfectly natural.
And I think this is a huge relief for learners, Because instead of worrying too much about choosing between much and many all the time, you can often just use a lot of and be safe.
Exactly. It's almost like a neutral option, something that works in most situations, especially when you're speaking. Let's compare a few sentences so you can really feel the difference. I have much time. I have a lot of time.
The first one is correct, but sounds a bit unnatural. The second one is what people actually say.
Another one, she has much work to do. She has a lot of work to do.
Same idea. The second one feels much more natural in everyday English. And I think this is where learners start to shift their mindset. Because instead of asking, what is correct, they start asking, what sounds natural?
Yeah, and that's a very important step in becoming more fluent. Because real communication is not just about being correct, it's about sounding comfortable and natural. All right, so now we've seen how much and many work, why much is limited in real usage, and how a lot of fits into everything.
So now, let's take this one step further. Because there's another layer to this topic that can still cause confusion.
Yeah, now we're going to look at how these words behave in real situations, and how small choices can change the feeling of a sentence.
All right, so now let's move away from just the explanation and start looking at how this actually appears in real conversations, because this is where things start to become more intuitive.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're not thinking about grammar rules when you're speaking. You're asking questions, you're reacting, you're trying to communicate quickly, and these choices happen almost automatically. So let's start with something very common, asking questions. Imagine you're talking to someone and you want to know about their schedule. You might say, "Do you have much time today?"
And this sounds completely natural, because as we said before, much works very well in questions.
Now let's try another one. Do you have many friends in this city?
Again, perfectly natural, because now we're talking about something countable. So we use many.
And if you notice, these questions feel very light, very natural. There's no effort, no hesitation.
Exactly, because in these structures, English already expects much and many, so they fit naturally into the sentence. Now, let's look at what happens when we answer these questions, because this is where things change a little.
So imagine someone asks you, "Do you have much time today?" Now, what would you say?
Most people would say, I don't have much time, or I have a lot of things to do.
Exactly. Notice what happened here. We used much in the negative, but a lot of in the affirmative idea.
And this is a pattern you'll see again and again. Much, questions and negatives, a lot of, affirmative statements.
Let's try another one. Do you drink much coffee?
Now the answers would naturally be, I don't drink much coffee, I drink a lot of coffee.
Not I drink much coffee.
Exactly. Even though it's technically possible, it just doesn't sound natural in everyday speech. Now, let's talk about many for a second, because many behaves a little differently from much.
Yeah. Many is actually more flexible in affirmative sentences than much. You can say, "There are many people here," and that sounds perfectly natural.
Right. So many doesn't have the same problem that much has.
But even with many, in casual conversation, people still often prefer a lot of.
Yeah. So instead of, there are many people here, you'll often hear, there are a lot of people here.
So again, we see the same pattern. A lot of sounds more relaxed, more conversational.
While many can sometimes sound slightly more formal or a bit more structured.
Let's build a quick conversation. Are there many people at the party?
Yeah, there are a lot of people here.
Perfect. Notice how the question uses many, and the answer naturally shifts to a lot of.
Another one. Do you have much work to do?
I don't have much work today, but I have a lot of meetings. And this is exactly how real conversations flow. You don't stay rigid with one structure, you move naturally between them.
And I think this is where things really start to click for learners, because they realize something important. English is not just about choosing the correct form. It's about choosing the most natural form for that moment.
Yeah, and sometimes the correct form is not the one people actually use most often. All right, so now we've seen how this works in real conversations.
Let's take this one step further, because there are still a few subtle points that can help you sound even more natural.
Yeah, especially small choices that make a big difference in fluency.
All right, so before we finish, let's explore one more layer that can really improve how natural your English sounds. Because up to now, we've been focusing on structure. But there's also something else happening here, the feeling of the sentence.
Yeah, because different choices don't just change correctness. They can also change how strong, natural, or conversational something sounds. Let's compare two sentences. There are many problems, there are a lot of problems.
Both are correct, but they don't feel exactly the same.
Exactly. Many problems can sound a bit more formal, a bit more serious, while a lot of problems sounds more conversational, more natural in everyday speech.
And sometimes, many can actually feel stronger or more emphatic.
Yeah, especially when you want to highlight quantity in a more structured way. Many people believe this is true.
This sounds a bit more formal, almost like something you would hear in a presentation or article.
Now compare. A lot of people believe this is true.
This sounds more relaxed, more like everyday conversation.
So again, it's not just about right or wrong, it's about tone.
All right, now let's look at a few mistakes that are a little more subtle, things that even intermediate learners sometimes get wrong.
We've already seen this, but it's worth repeating. I have much work today.
Even though it's correct, it sounds unnatural.
The natural version, I have a lot of work today.
Another common issue is misclassifying the noun.
For example, many information,
Information is uncountable.
so the correct version is much information or more naturally, a lot of information.
And sometimes learners try to avoid a lot of because they think it's too simple.
Yeah, but that's a mistake, because a lot of is exactly what native speakers use all the time.
Simple doesn't mean wrong. In fact, simple is often more natural.
All right, so now let's make this a bit interactive. I'll give you a sentence, and you choose what feels right. I don't have time today.
Much.
There are people in the room.
Many or a lot of.
I have friends in this city.
A lot of.
Do you have money with you?
Much.
And if you noticed, you're not just applying rules anymore. You're starting to feel what sounds right.
Exactly. And that's the transition you want to make as a learner. All right. So, before we finish, let's step back and simplify everything we talked about today.
Because we covered a lot. And the goal is not to remember everything. It's to remember the core idea. So let's break it down one more time. Many. Countable nouns, much. Uncountable nouns, a lot of. Both.
And then the second layer, much, mostly in questions and negatives, a lot of, preferred in affirmative sentences. And I think the biggest shift for learners is this. Stop asking only, is this correct? Start asking, does this sound natural?
Exactly. Because real fluency comes from that feeling, not just from knowing the rule. So here's a simple trick you can use. If you're not sure, use a lot of.
It will almost always work, and it will sound natural. So imagine this quickly. You want to say you're busy. What sounds better? I have much work today. I have a lot of work today.
The second one. Always. And I think this is what makes English interesting. It's not just about structure. It's about how people actually use the language.
Yeah, and once you understand that, these small choices become much easier. Because in the end, natural English is not about complicated rules.
It's about simple patterns, used in the right way.
All right, that's it for today.
Yeah. And this is one of those topics that can really improve your fluency quickly.
If you start paying attention to this, you'll notice the difference almost immediately.
So here's a question for you. What do you say more naturally? Many or a lot of?
Yeah, think about your own English and share an example with us. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, guys.